Okay, yeah. So we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for showing up today and attending our second seminar of our Science Communication Seminar Series for 2022. We're really excited that you've all been able to join us again today. Today's speaker, I'm really thrilled we were able to get Dr. Todd Newman, who got his Ph.D. in communication at American University, and then moved on to his postdoctoral research assistant position at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. He's currently an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Life Sciences Communication, and his research focuses on the role of strategic communication within the context of science, technology, and the environment. So without further ado, Todd, you're welcome to start.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, for that nice introduction, and Akila for reaching out to me originally to come to this. It's really nice to be here with all of you. And yeah, I think I'll kind of jump in, and I guess we'll just save questions for the end. I guess that's the normal protocol.
Yes, if you have questions throughout, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll make sure that Todd answers them at the end. Thank you.
Great. Okay, let me just share my screen really quick. Okay. And then... All right, great. Well, it's so good to be with you all today to talk a little bit about the research I've been doing more recently, focusing on the branding of science, which I'm sure is something that might be a new way of thinking about science communication. And I hope spur some questions about how the public and scientists think about science, and also go into the way in which I approach science communication, which is through a very strategic lens. So I am a science communication researcher, but I teach many courses at UW-Madison in science or in strategic communication and marketing, specifically to both at the undergraduate and graduate level, kind of wrapped around this context of science. So yeah, just an overview for kind of what you're going to expect in this talk, because we're going to kind of start with this this kind of broad level about what is branding, what is marketing, why do I see this as relevant to science communication, and then go a little bit into the strategic orientation, which I think, from my understanding, many of you are interested, and it's even seen from the poll, in learning more about science communication and engagement. And I guess one of the main takeaways from this that I hope resonates with all of you is what does it mean to think strategically in this sense? So I'm going to start off with this statement from Larry Page, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, although some of the undergrads that I've talked about this with have no idea who Larry Page is. But Larry Page is one of the co-founders of Google, and this was back some years ago in 2007. But he gave a talk to AAAS, and he basically stated in this talk, the title of it, "Science is a Serious Marketing Problem," that virtually all economic growth in the world was due to technological progress. And I think as a society, we're not really paying attention to that. Not too long ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I'm happy to talk about the effectiveness of him as a science communicator in the Q&A, and what that does, I think, for both good and bad for science communication. But he came out with this article in the Wall Street Journal, I guess an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. This was in 2021, saying that science needs better marketing. Again, this theme of marketing and science, comes up in the popular media quite a bit, but also, right, is one of these terms that's getting thrown around a lot. But what exactly is the core of this? So I'm sure some of you maybe at one point, but maybe not the majority, have taken a course maybe in business or in marketing or strategic communication or PR, most likely not. So I'm gonna just give you a brief overview and about what marketing is. And so marketing is really of this idea of making a value proposition. It answers the question, why should I care? Marketers are in the business of understanding what matters to their consumers, right? And marketing products, services, and as I'll argue, ideas, right, around this idea of understanding what that value proposition is among their audiences and how to connect with it. And most fundamentally, it answers this, why should I care? So I like to use this example of Porsche, right? Because I think cars, for those that study marketing, is just a really good case study in understanding the social and psychological implications for why we buy what we buy. But, we buy cars, each of us that has bought a car, and it's sometimes, you think back of what are the reasons why you bought that car, and, why do you buy a Subaru versus a Volvo versus a Porsche in this context. And what's important to understand about something like Porsche, for example, is that Porsche recognizes that its value is not just on getting someone from point A to point B, right? Like most auto vehicles do, but it's about filling a deeper value proposition based off of psychological and social characteristics. In marketing, we call this ideal state. How do you see yourself? What is it about yourself that you wish to be? And if you can read the copy on this, which you might not be able to, but it says, of all the emotions you can expect while driving a Boxster, regret will never be one of them, right? So really tapping into that innate desire, right, to have this car, right, that doesn't just tap into this immediate benefit of getting from point A to point B, but as I'll talk about more of a symbolic, right, something that identifies with ego, something that identifies with self-identification. A great example, and in Wisconsin, this where I'm based, right, is a born and bred company, which is Harley Davidson, right? And Harley Davidson, just like Porsche, doesn't just sell cars, or in this case, motorcycles, but they sell a lifestyle. They sell freedom with attitude, right? You never see a ad of Harley Davidson with someone pulling out of a suburban, community and driving off. You never see someone in congested traffic, right? It's about, they understand what their market is. They understand what their lifestyle is. They understand what, I'll argue, their brand is, right? And that is essential for understanding how not only you as an entity like Harley Davidson see yourself, but also how your customers see you. So this term marketing problem, I like to think of it more as a branding problem. And again, branding is part of marketing. Marketing is kind of a more complex connection. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of the 4 Ps, but right, marketing is not just about promotion, but it's about pricing, and it's about the product, and it's about distribution. But a brand really is this intangible asset, right? That is intended to create distinctive images and associations in the minds of stakeholders, thereby generating benefit and value. It's an unspoken starting point. It's emotional, it's sensory, it's a cognitive reflex, right? It's very much, if I say cactus and you immediately have these nodes that start thinking, Arizona, warm, prickly, green, right? You have these connections to something, to a stimulus, and that is very much what a brand is trying to understand what that immediate, intuitive reaction is to a product, a service, and as I'll talk about, an idea as well, right? So this understanding of science as a branding problem, I think is a good primer for where I want to go next, into understanding how this plays into my view and colleagues that I've collaborators that I've done this research with, into how this looks for strategic science communication. And so I like to start with this kind of broad overview, and we'll kind of touch on each of these points. But this orientation is about knowing thyself. How are you perceived? It's about knowing thy goal. What are you trying to do with your science communication or engagement? And it's knowing your audience. What do they care about and why? And I'll start off with this, I think, most important question, because I think it's one that, as a science communication community, and for those that do research and trying to understand, how to connect science and society, there's been a lot more research done on how audiences think about different scientific issues. In my field of work, what are the different attitudes, values, beliefs, etc., that distinguish why some publics agree with certain scientific findings and some are dismissive of it. And this idea of knowing your brand is really a fundamental starting point. And I want to show an example of what it means when you don't know your brand. Coca-Cola, right? And this is a case study in marketing when it comes to branding. So I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard of New Coke before. This was introduced in 1985, probably before many of you were born. Maybe some of you do remember it. But New Coke was introduced to come onto the market, right, to compete with these new sodas and new non-cola beverages that were, taking their market share. And in taste tests, right, consumers overwhelmingly were saying Pepsi, which was growing a market share at that time, had a sweeter taste, and the formula was one they liked more. So what New Coke did was decided to create a new formula, rebranded around New Coke, try to connect to these tastes of consumers. And when Coke hit the market, it was a failure. It was a failure, and it received major backlash. Why did it receive major backlash? Coca-Cola, in essence, is just fizzy, caramelated soda water, right? That many of us, right, aren't drinking for nutritious purposes, but, right, maybe we crave the taste. But Coke has something very unique, which is a strong brand. Coca-Cola is nostalgic, right? You go into old-timey diners, right, and you see the Coca-Cola memorabilia. If any of you are from the South, right, Coca-Cola started. It's a major part of the culture there. And so Coke didn't understand this about their brand, about just how nostalgic and how much of these social and psychological aspects were connected to this brand. So, right, New Coke failed, and that's why when you see Coca-Cola cans, it says Coca-Cola Classic, right? So if you take one thing away from this talk, you now know why Coca-Cola Classic is labeled the way that it is. So when I say brand, what are the different touch points of a brand? What are the different factors that allow us to think about a brand? And this is a framework that I use in my research and current research that I'm doing now with a couple graduate students in the department, is trying to unpack how we can use frameworks of branding to better understand how to think about the strategic communication of science broadly. And I'd love to have this discussion at some point, but also sciences, right? This term science communication gets thrown around, but each science is very different ways of understanding the world, very different ways of dealing with uncertainty, and very different needs and desires for how they think about communication and engagement. But at a very basic level, right, these three intersect in different ways. So the first is functional, right? A brand connects to an individual based off of its functional need. It solves a problem. It meets some, right, specific goal, right? I like the idea of a lawnmower. A lawnmower cuts your lawn. It's very specific. Sure, you can have lawnmowers that cost X number of dollars, and you can have ones that have faster or lower, and I'll get into how these kind of overlap. But there is this basic need, right? This functional need that a brand connects with. As I mentioned before, there's also a symbolic need, right? And symbolic is important because symbolic, and I think for many of the brands, if I was, to poll the audience, what are the brands that you connect with most? I'm sure for many of you, yeah, you'll say the functional need in terms of, yeah, it does something that I think works really well, but it's also something that you connect to for different reasons. For example, because of the values behind the company or the organization. It's about, how using specific brands connects to the type of person that you are. Tonight connects to the type of individuals within the groups that you interact with. It has ego identification, for the example of Porsche, right? It does this to help develop the image that one desires to have. And there's also this experiential component, right? And I'm not sure many of you know what this is. And frankly, I don't know either, at least to some extent, but this is a picture taken from a restaurant in Chicago called Alinea, which is a hot cuisine, molecular gastronomy. I think this is some jello-y type, I don't know what. But anyway, when you go to this restaurant, you're going there for an experience. You're not going there to fill this functional need of, I'm really hungry and I need food. You're going there for sensory pleasure. You're going there for a feeling you get. It's art, right? It has this really powerful experience with your taste, with your smells, etc. So all of these different components, right? The functional, the experiential, and the symbolic help solidify how a brand connects to its audience. And in many cases, right, it's, and I would say that actually the majority of cases, right, it's really difficult for a company to touch on all of these very effectively, right? There's usually one or two that a company really prides itself on, especially in how it communicates. But nonetheless, right, depending on who your audience is, and this is another point I hope to kind of drive home through this talk, is that different audiences may have different connections to the brand, but for some brands that, right, don't have necessarily a competitor that they share market share with, and I'll argue science is unique in that kind of sense, where you can differentiate quite easily, and a brand can take over more experiential or functional components or symbolic in their advertising and promotions. This presents a more complex idea. So what is the value proposition of science following this framework? And so on one level, science is experiential, or science is functional, right? Science brings us new technology. It allows us to cure diseases. It helps build buildings and bridges. I mean, really, there's nothing that we can think of that didn't start from, scientific knowledge. And right, we can argue to the extent, not really argue, but discuss, right, how science is then applied into practical things. But nonetheless, science and scientific research drives most of the devices, most of the healthcare, most of the everything that we interact with. Science is also experiential, right? And I'm sure for many of you that do bench work, right? I mean, you experience the process of doing science. But for many outside of that, what are the ways in which they experience science? So movies, right, are one, like Interstellar. And I would argue probably one of the most broad and one of the most broad mediums in which science is connected to the public. And, for those of you that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the National Academies of Science has a great program called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. It actually brings Hollywood filmmakers and scientists together to try to get the science as accurate as possible in the movies. We also experience science going to museums. This is from the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, in the top middle. They have this great exhibit on weather. You can touch weather. You can see how weather forms. It's quite fascinating. And for informal science education, we see in growing up through K through 12 education, we go to science festivals, whether it's on campuses or museums or even in their own schools, right? We have this experience of doing science. And then I always just like these little little globes that you could touch with the electro pulse. And I don't know, I always thought that was an interesting connection to science. But there's also the symbolic form of science, right? The ability of the brand to project one's self-image, communicate the kind of person that they are or that they want to be, right? We think about the space race, that happened in the 50s and 60s, both in the US and the Soviet Union, and how much of science was communicated as this, new frontier and this new progress in science, and really solidified, right, this value proposition of what it means, in this case, to be an American and seeing, a man walk on the moon. And more recently, we've seen this with the March for Science, which I've written about, and I'm happy to talk about this as well. I have opinions on this, but I would argue there's been few direct organized events that were so explicitly focused on science, and how science connects into our everyday lives. I mean, most of these marches were drawn from a belief, not only in the US, but all around the world, of policymakers not taking scientific evidence into their policy decisions. And we can look at this and see, right, how this, and we call this in branding research, right, a brand community, of people, of individuals that are connected around this idea of strong deference to science. So, right, you can see exactly in this just how group membership, ego identification, right, understanding your in-group can play into this. So the research that my colleagues and I have done is to think more about, well, how can we, through surveys, both of scientists and of the general public, understand what is the brand of science? What are these intuitive thoughts and feelings that come up when one is primed with the question of, how do you think, what is science? How do you feel when you hear the word science? And we came up with this question. This was done with a colleague of mine, Chris Volpe, who runs a nonprofit called Science Counts. And through a number of focus groups that he conducted, right, he kind of saw these 5 general emotions, feelings that generally came up in how these broad audiences were thinking about science specifically, right? Not primed on, how to think about science, but just when you hear the word science, what comes to your mind? And so I'm going to present data from 3, 5 different surveys. And 2 of these surveys are of scientists. So the AAU survey and the Society survey both are scientists. And the AAU survey is the Association, or American Association of Universities. I always get the acronym kind of confused, but anyway, Association of American Universities is written right there. But anyway, this group is the largest 62 R1 institutions in North America. So all of the private and all of the public R1 institutions in Canada, McGill and Toronto are also included in there. And we have a database of, some, I think just under 20,000 scientists that we did a random sampling based on academic discipline, based on career level. We stratified that to make sure that we can get kind of the most representative sample as possible. And we did this survey once in fall 2018, so pre-COVID, and then in winter 2021 during COVID. We also did a society survey sample. So this was a survey of 27 different professional STEM societies. So probably many of the societies you all probably have affiliations to, and I'm happy to kind of provide a list if anyone's interested of what those who those societies are. And we had quite a large response rate for that, just over 3,600. And this was, again, fielded before COVID. And then a public. So these are general public opinion surveys that were conducted in fall 2019 and one in fall 2020. And I want to go in now into what we found and the implications of that. So the three columns on the left, the AAU, Society AAU, these are the scientist surveys, and these are the two surveys of the public. So, you know, we found a number that fell into the other category, not surprisingly. And in the scientist surveys, the two AAU and the Society, we did decide to try our best to recode those into different categories, which we didn't do in the public, but you'll notice that difference won't make too much of an impact, but you'll see kind of the strike throughs on those. So just a forewarning. But discovery and wonder, right, came up quite a bit, or not quite a bit, but came up, you know, on a, you know, below 5%, below for discovery and wonder. Evidence, knowledge, truth, a little bit higher. Curiosity and interest, growing a little bit higher. And then where we see more of the public responses falling into is this boredom and indifference, right? 10% around with the public, and with the Society, about 1%. So this is saying there are scientists who are answering this survey and saying that science to them means boredom and indifference, which I don't know if what's driving that, but maybe they're not happy with their current career trajectory. Fear and caution, not surprisingly, doesn't come up at all with scientists. With the public, quite a bit more. But the main findings, and this is the crux of the research and the directions we're going, are these two emotions: joy and excitement and hope. And what we see with this is a pretty interesting difference in pattern between the public and the scientists. So with the public, right, 56% in 2019 and 45% in 2020 indicated hope as the word that came to mind when they were asked to, you know, choose one of these different words, most likely. While only 13 and 19% indicated joy and excitement. Now, hope is still, you know, just under 40%, between 35, 40%, 35, 38% among scientists. But you see joy and excitement is much higher, right? 43% in 2018, 38% or 33% in 2021, 38% in 2018 for the Society. We've been trying to probe in this survey through the you know, limited measures that we have, but like, why is there this 10% drop between 2018 and 2021? And you know, the variable we hypothesize is that, right, COVID had some explanation for this, that, right, there was this joy and excitement maybe sucked out a little bit more during this time. But nonetheless, right, these differences between how the scientists think and feel about science, right, is quite a bit higher than how the public thinks about science when it comes to joy and excitement. So what does this mean? So we've been, and by we, mainly my colleague Chris Volpe and I, have been kind of teasing apart these two different dimensions. So we see joy and excitement as this emotional reward in the present, this process-minded, right? When you ask, I mean, for many of you, I'm sure one of the reasons you got into science was you really enjoyed, you know, the research that you do, the experience of going in every day, trying to, right, test hypotheses, trying to see how you can uncover new and interesting things about, right, the physical, life sciences, you know, whatever aspect of science that you're interested in. And this is quite different than, right, what we see with hope, right? And hope is a very deep literature. And I found myself reading more about clinical psychology than I thought I would in terms of what is hope and how is it measured. And but in essence, right, hope is really this idea of an eventual outcome, a feeling or a desire for a certain thing to happen. And so we call this payoff-minded orientation, right? It is what is science going to do for me? And I'll talk a little bit more in shortly about what I think that means. So put this a different way for those of you that prefer looking at these data in graphic form. So hope is on the x-axis, joy and excitement on the y-axis, and you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between where the scientists are clustered, which is up here, and where the public is right here. And so the question, and this is a question that I think within the science communication and public engagement community, both among practitioners and among science communication researchers and social scientists like myself, is what's the goal with this? Is it to get the public to see joy and excitement more in science? That joy and excitement, right, would drive scientists, which we've identified, and it's been pretty consistent across surveys, is really important intrinsic feelings to them that, right, you could argue also motivate them, right, to get into science communication and engagement, right, sharing this joy and excitement of science. Is the goal to try to bring the public to that view? Or conversely, is it that scientists who see high joy and excitement need to understand how that connects to hope, how that connects to a desire for a certain thing to happen? And my feeling and how I've approached this is, communication is about, right, this two-way dialogue. And I think for those of you, it said in the survey, you've had some interest and feel like you've done some readings, whether self-guided study or maybe doing a workshop or other types of training. This idea of engagement is not just, right, you as a scientist communicating to an audience and expecting the audience to try to see the science the way you do, but it's also how your engagement with these publics, right, who might see science very differently than you, change your beliefs as a scientist in terms of the research that you do, the research questions you ask, and your fundamental strategy when it comes to communicating with these audiences. And so this is I think a unique finding that we're continuing as a research group to think more into, about these different kind of starting points for science among scientists and the public, and how to think about what the strategy is for effective engagement. Now, knowing thy goal. And this is really where the strategic orientation, I think, is most important. What are you trying to do and why? So I present this photo of I don't even know what they're serving, but it's a dinner party. I'm sure many of us have started maybe having more dinner parties recently than we have in the last several years. So, right, an optimistic picture. But what is a goal, objective, and a tactic? And in strategic communication, right, this is really important, a really important framework for understanding how to go into science communication in a way that you can not only strategize about what you want to do and what you want to get out of this engagement, but also thinking about what are you actually, like, how can you actually measure that you're having an impact that you have? So to kind of start with a metaphor, when we think about goals and objectives tactics, I found this really useful. And this is from a conversation piece that a colleague of mine, two colleagues of mine who I do a lot of this research with, John Besley and Anthony Dudo, wrote in the conversation several years ago. But when you think about a goal, this is really this highest level, this really high level outcome, right? When you think for a meal like this, maybe it's you want to serve a satisfying meal that your guests love. Maybe you want to make sure that they don't leave your dinner party full, right? It's really broad, and it's difficult, right, for something like this to begin to strategize. Where do we go from here? Your objective then is how you start beginning to connect that goal. So you want to serve a satisfying meal, but what type of cuisine do you want to serve? Do you want to serve dishes that are light and savory, maybe heavy and rich? Do you want to end with something sweet, right? This is planning out what dishes you're thinking of serving broadly. And then tactics are really where the rubber meets the road, right? These are the actual specific dishes that you're going to serve. Are you going to serve a pasta? Are you going to serve a salad? What type of salad are you going to serve? And how does that, right, flow from the objectives that you had? And so goals, objectives, and tactics are, I think, a really important way for those of you that are interested in science communication and engagement to think more strategically about what the outcomes are that you want from this experience. And so this is a model, again, that Nicole Bennett, who's a Ph.D. student at the University of Texas, Austin, and Anthony Dudo and John Besley wrote, putting together a framework to how to think about this. And there's been quite a bit of research we've been doing, which I'm not going to go into too deep, but I'm happy to share papers on this for those that are interested. But how do we think about goals, objectives, and tactics within the context of science communication? And so to start with goals, right, what is motivating you to even take part in communication and engagement, right? Are you trying to gain policy support for something? Maybe policy opposition? Are you trying to change individual behavior? What are the concrete, right, outcomes that you see yourself going into science communication or engagement with? And oftentimes, this is one of the things that I think is overlooked by a lot of scientists. And coming from the Alan Alda Center, I did trainings all over the country with faculty, graduate students, other researchers, about thinking through the strategic orientation. And goals are something that maybe are in the back of their mind, but unless they're pressed to think about them, unless they're pressed to think about them and write them down, right, they're not concrete. And I think that's a really important part of a lot of what science communication training, which is a field that I've done quite a bit of work in, is a strategy, right? I'm not sure if any of you have done the message box with one of the different training organizations, but a way to begin to strategize about this. Then your communication objectives and outcomes, right? So if your goal is policy support, right, how do you think about the different ways in which you want, similar to, right, are you serving savory and sweet, or you or say light and savory, or rich and heavy, right? What are these different relational, behavioral, and more traditional outcomes that you're looking for, right? How do you use different types of ways to connect, whether it's through shared beliefs, whether it's through behavioral, like normative outcomes, or perceived risks and benefits. This is really where you're strategizing, right? How you think about how your goal is going to translate into a strategy in terms of how you are going to kind of put boundaries around the type of engagement or communication that you are going to partake in. And then finally are the tactics, right? And again, just like the dish that you're going to serve at a dinner party, right? This is where the rubber meets the road, right? What are the specific messages, right? What are the specific frames of reference? How are you trying to communicate about, if you're doing, research on, CRISPR technology, are you communicating through an ethical lens? Are you communicating it through a lens of eradicating certain diseases? Are you communicating it through right? What are the messages and tone and style that you're using? And then what are the channels and sources, right? I think a big part of strategic science communication is understanding that not all communication channels and sources are equal, right? Communicating on social media is, and Twitter and Facebook, or writing a blog post like on The Conversation, right, which is an open access forum that academics can share their research on. For those that aren't familiar, what are the different audiences for those, and what can you get across within those different in those different channels? And so holistically, right, these I think are a really good way to think about these connections between goals, objectives, and tactics. And my colleagues and I have been trying to tease out a number of the relationships that scientists have between the importance of maybe specific goals and what communication tactics or outcomes they think they are most interested in using, they think that are most interested and effective. And then on the flip side, what do we know from different types of experimental research that actually helps individuals to connect to a different scientific message? And then I wanted to just highlight this because I think this is a fascinating finding that keeps appearing over and over again in the scientist surveys that we do. And this is from, again, those two surveys that we did, the Association of American Universities, right? This kind of very large probability sample that we did of scientists across all career levels at different R1 institutions. And we asked them to rank on a slider scale, which is most important, least important, 100 most important, 0 least important. And what we find over and over again is that helping to inform people about scientific issues is always the outcome that comes up most frequently, right? And this, for those of you that have heard of this term, the deficit model, before, falls directly into that, right? This idea that the information will speak for itself, that all people take up that information in the same way, which we know is just not the case through many different strands of research. But what's most, I think, interesting is that hearing what others think about scientific issues is ranked the lowest across all of these. And this is essentially what so much of public engagement work, and I think those that are funding programs in public engagement and science communication, right, a number of foundations have programs on this. And I think what the practitioners, right, feel as something they want to get across in their trainings is that, right, effective communication is about, right, not just informing, not just this one-way channel of communication, but rather hearing what others think about those scientific issues and how they play a role into how you do the science that you do and how you think about, right, what strategies to communicate. And so I think this brings up an interesting juxtaposition on that front. And then finally is knowing thy audience. So I told you earlier that hope was this thought and feeling that came up so predominantly across public surveys, right? And this finding most interestingly held when controlling for political ideology and even many different demographics in terms of age, income, et cetera. And knowing and understanding the extent to which this complex emotion manifests, I think, is really key to understanding these connections and how we can make more strategic connections in our strategic science communication engagement. And so kind of went over this, so I'll skip ahead. But what does it mean, hope, in this context? And I think this is very illustrative of this specifically. And these are from data that, again, Science Counts conducted in one of their public opinion surveys. And the shapes aren't as important for the context here, although they do refer to other levels of education. But you can see for across these three different issues: environment, national defense, health, and medicine. The question was asked, the percentage of US adults who say this issue should be an urgent focus of scientific research. For the environment, it's not surprising that liberals, right, rank it as much more important than conservatives, or moderates are kind of somewhere in between. Why? Because I think there's a lot of public opinion research and others that, right, the environment is an issue that connects more closely with liberals for a variety of reasons when it comes to their ideology, worldview, right, their views on how society should progress. When we look at defense, right, we see the inverse, right? Liberals rank that priority much lower. Conservatives rank it much higher. Why? National defense, right? Again, one of these close issues to the conservative ideology. And right, when that application of science is presented to them, right, view that importance of scientific research much more strongly. The good thing is that there are these areas of science that don't see this same level of polarization, at least broadly, right? And we can, I mean, if we were to tease this out into vaccines and other things like that, it might look much different. But health and medicine in general, right, is strong across all political ideologies, right? Somewhere in the 80% range. And this is, I think, been a really consistent and strong finding in that, right, health and medicine is not only, from research we've done, is not only the kind of first thing that comes to mind when the public thinks about science, right? The health and medicine aspect is immediately what comes up, but also shows this kind of non-politicized, at least macro kind of application of science that other areas of science doesn't fall into. So what this shows, I think most, I mean, to put a point on it, is that science is a utility. Science takes on meaning to the public when it's connected to issues that they care about, right? Across, for those of you that have ever looked at surveys of the most trusted institutions in the US, right, scientists are the number 2 behind the military and I think doctors. And it's been consistent for the last, 50, 60 years. So science in itself doesn't have, right, necessarily that any kind of negative connection to it. But when the application is made for what that science is going to do, this is where we begin to see these differences emerge. So I like to end on this. Another, I'm fond of these analogies, but we all disagree on music genres. I don't like country music, not my thing, but I do really like jazz music. I enjoy listening to it, and I'm sure we can, people can have the complete opposite, hate jazz music, love country music. But in the end, we still enjoy music. And why is that? Why is it that we can dislike different types of music, but we still respect music as an art? And maybe the art is very different than the science. But nonetheless, what are the things about music that I see as overlapping with this is that we all have experience with music, right? We've all tried to play instruments. We've all, gone to shows. We have this strong, we get these feelings from it. We get these connections to it. But, with science, it's not the same. We don't all have that experience. We don't all have that understanding of, again, that process, right? What so much of scientists find of value, the public, not as much. So to conclude, science supporters and institutions need to make value propositions consistent with science's brand identity, right? And in many ways, this has been focused around, right, this idea of group membership identification, right? Those that think like me, those that act like me. I have a really hard time when people say there's a war on science, when people say that someone is anti-science. Like, that does very little public good for trying to make science something that's not, just another lapel pin that Democrats put on their, jacket, right? But again, science is broadly well supported, But right, when the symbolic frame comes in, it does create these distinctions. So much of it, in my view, is thinking about these functional and experiential aspects, right? Thinking about, right, what are the experiences in which, right, we can think about how to engage and communicate science in a more effective way. And more importantly, these functional aspects. What is it? How does the science affect me as an everyday individual? What is it going to do to my life, to my family's life, to my children's life, 50 years from now, 10 years from now? And that, again, that science's utility is a really important backdrop to that. And so I'd be remiss if, as a marketing professor, I wouldn't market a little bit. But for those of you that don't know, I'm from the Department of Life Science Communication at UW-Madison, and we're unique in that we're a department that only does research in science communication. So our whole department focuses on this area, and we have a Ph.D. minor, so we get a lot of scientists from the natural and physical and life sciences that take our Ph.D. minor and get courses in science communication. This was a book that I edited on science communication training, which really tried to bring together a lot of the different thinkers on what does it look like to design trainings? How do we think about training more broadly, and where it started and where it is now, and effective strategies for making, right, this skill set that most scientists, unless you come from the social sciences or have a degree program that offers these courses, right, can think about effective ways to develop these types of programs. And I'm happy to send anyone a copy of this book on a PDF if you want to email me. I also think, because of this specific audience, the SciPep group that just recently started, it stands for Science, Public Engagement, and Partnership, which was founded by the Kavli Foundation and U.S. Department of Energy. They put on a conference last summer, and myself and my colleagues Dominique Brossard and Dietram Schleufele led a report for them, really trying to do a landscape of what does public engagement look like for researchers that do basic science, right? Researchers that do fundamental research, and do they have different obstacles, and do they have different opportunities when it comes to research that really the application is not clear and goes against some of the kind of strategies I was alluding to earlier. And then they also have a manifesto, or not a manifesto, but a prospectus, although sometimes it feels like it's a little them just telling their feelings, but about what does a path look like for this type of public engagement in science, public engagement with basic science. So I do suggest you can get these all on their website, scipep.org. And I think it's a really interesting movement within the public engagement community to think about the unique opportunities of basic science researchers. So, and finally, this just recently came out, which I think is another great resource, and I wrote a chapter on here on strategic science communication, on the whole concept of strategic, or really science communication in the current politicized age that we're in. So, yeah. With that, feel free to email me. My address is there if you have any questions or want to connect. And that's my Twitter feed, and I try to tweet out little nuggets of SciComm stuff. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much for presenting your work and such interesting findings. But does anyone have any questions for Todd about his research or about his thoughts on science communication? We'll give everyone a few minutes to type it in. In the meantime, I have questions. I was curious I guess this is kind of a minor question, but do you get a higher response rate of your surveys from the scientists that you poll versus the general public?
No. Scientists are not always keen on answering cold emails. And we follow, there's kind of a standard within survey research to do, 2 or 3 follow-ups, and We try to incentivize it, and that we're willing to share results. And our results have always been kind of biased too towards more senior faculty and research staff compared to more junior. And there is quite a bit of, I know there's energy around doing more kind of research like this, but with graduate students, postdocs, early career faculty, to see how those differences emerge. But yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I could ask you a million questions, but we do have one in the Q&A. It's from Angela Snyder. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. This person says, thank you. They have a question. So how do you feel about the role of TikTok in the science communication sphere?
Yeah, I think, in full disclosure, I don't use TikTok, but first of all, I know just from teaching undergraduates that like TikTok is their primary source of information. And I think there are a lot of really good science communicators on TikTok. And I think, especially when it comes to kind of science communicators that are coming from different backgrounds and different, life experiences and different ethnicities. And I think that's good for science communication, considering I think SciComm has a major DEI problem that I think is more and more trying. I think there's movement towards trying to create infrastructure that is more supportive of that. But I'm all about you reach your audience where they are, and I guess the flip side of that, and I think with a lot of social media, is that your audience on TikTok is going to be your choir, and you're basically just going to be who's going to be watching these videos is probably those that are really highly engaged and interested in science. And none of us know how the algorithms of TikTok, Facebook, or Twitter work. You hope there would be some incidental exposure maybe to more people seeing these videos. But I think the visual communication, like the visual social medias, like especially Instagram and TikTok, I think are used quite well. And I have a colleague in the department, Kai-Ping Chen, who is a computational communication researcher who's doing more and more work trying to pull from, basically scrape the API of Instagram and TikTok and look at the visuals and look at content and trying to get a better idea of what that looks like within the science communication landscape.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. So we have another question from Justin, who asks, do you think this war on science during the COVID age is overblown, and will it have an impact on the global perception of science? He says, thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if it's as much of a, as someone who's been studying this for some time and who's looked at, especially debates on climate change and stem cell and, even gene editing technologies, any kind of emerging tech. It's always going. I think there's always been this politicization, and I don't think there's any way around that. I think science is political. It always has been. It always will be. I don't think it needs to be partisan, and that's, I think, where a lot of the kind of way in which I conceptualize this tries to find broad shared values that maybe can be used as effective lenses for communicating broader audiences. But will this have an impact? Sure. And I think why it is because this has been the most salient, I think, for the majority of the world in terms of just how politics and science intersect. And I don't think there's been media coverage on this as much as there has been during COVID. But I also, I think, I don't know. I take issue with this war on science because I don't think it's a war on science. I think it's more of a and I think, I've said this before, like, I think if anything that I hope comes out of COVID, it's like there's more humility, which is something that I think a lot of us that do the work that we do, especially those in training, try to embed, is that it's trying to understand the root of why someone doesn't take a vaccine, the root of why someone thinks the way they do. And yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of dynamics when it comes to the media ecosystem, and just the fast evolving pace of COVID, and how difficult that is for the media to coverage, and how people, especially the lay public, understand uncertainty in science. I think there's this I think this is an interesting just question to think about, but is how certainty in science is played out, and what is certain, and how that plays in. But yeah, I mean, I think if anything, I guess, I think there's more attention to this, at least from the media. The unfortunate side is the media is a vast, yeah, I don't know, can be a wasteland, but there's really good coverage. I just don't think it gets into everyone's view.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insights and your presentation today. It was really fascinating, and I'm really glad we had the opportunity to have you as part of our seminar series. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm happy to share the slides, or if anyone wants to get in contact, to share my contact information. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll email you when the next seminar is coming up next month, I believe.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.